And when I was reading this, I like stopped there and I said, okay, so the metaphorical meaning of wise as serpents. I think, well, I guess I've always just read that as, well, so I guess that means that serpents are wise and we should be wise.
But he started that where you read, he started that with the well-known fact about the snake.
You're right.
That's
like, true.
That it offers its whole body to assailants in place of its head, and I'm like, I didn't know that.
I didn't know that. I know. I know.
Welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Scholé Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Wenzel. You can find me over at afterthoughtsblog.net, spreading my Charlotte Mason joy through blog posts, study guides, audios, and more. My co-hosts today are Pam Barnhill, Mystie Winkler, and Abby Wall. Pam is a speaker, podcaster, blogger at pambarnhill.com, and author of 2 fabulous books, Better Together and Plan Your Year. Mystie is a second-generation homeschooler with 5 kids and too many projects. With her blog, podcast, and membership, she helps you organize your attitude so you can organize your life. Find her over at simplyconvivial.com. Abby is basically the queen of the Scholé sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer, rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whatever she can. If you are listening to this episode right when it comes out, the main session of spring training is Monday. Our coach this year is Rosaria Butterfield, author of a number of wonderful books, including The Secret Thoughts of an Unlikely Convert and The Gospel Comes with a House Key. We asked Rosaria to coach us on what we like to call intellectual hospitality. How do we read classics with discernment, handle disagreements with grace, or confront inconsistency and error with love? Rosaria is going to help us with all that and more. Just go to scholesisters.com/hospitality to register. In today's episode, Pam, Mystie, Abby, and I discuss portions of Saint Augustine's book On Christian Doctrine that deal with the need for background knowledge in order to read with understanding, especially understanding metaphors. This was a very fun reading assignment, and so without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scholé Everyday. Who would like to go first?
Me.
All right.
Okay.
Ooh, that's an evil laugh.
So I have a total system planned out for my 5x5 challenge for this year. And basically, I'm eating my frog first.
There you go.
Ooh.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Smart.
So what's the frog?
Death of Christian Culture.
Good book.
Yes. I think. Maybe. I don't know.
I loved it. I read it a few years ago.
Okay. It's not that I think that it's necessarily a bad book at all. It's just like, how much of this do I really understand? So yeah. I'm taking Abby's advice and I'm just like letting it wash over me and I'm not getting bogged down in it. So I am already on chapter 4 and I only started it like a week ago.
Wow.
I know, right? Like I'm like convicted to just keep moving, but I am really enjoying it in that I'm highlighting quite a few things and I understand what I highlight and I just kind of let the rest of it go. And I think this is kind of going to come into our conversation today. There are a lot of allusions in here. It's almost one of those books where you have to feel like you have to know things in order to be able to read it.
Yeah.
Which those are so fun to read if you know most of the things.
If you don't know most of the things, you're like, what is he talking about? When did we get on this subject? And what is he referring to? And, different things like that. So
it's like when I checked Milton's Paradise Lost out of the library when I was in high school, but I had never been taught much mythology at all.
Right.
And I was reading it and I was like, I can tell this is really beautiful, but I have no idea what it's talking about. Like, I didn't even know what the river Styx was. nothing. I was just baffled by the whole thing, but I knew it was beautiful. I could tell, but no comprehension because I didn't know any of the background information you needed to be able to read it.
Right. Yeah. And that's one of the things I'm struggling with. So I'm plowing through. This is probably one of those books I'm going to have to come back and read again. But this is one of those books where, okay, so like if we were doing a study for a book like this, it would be like, okay, we need to read all these things to be able,
right.
You know what I mean? To be able to understand.
Bibliographic trail. Yeah.
Yes.
Or more like the footnote trail, right? Like it's like what he's quoting.
But he doesn't always do even like footnotes for it. He just assumes he knows it. He just assumes that you know it.
Talking to educated people.
I know, right? But a couple of things that I have underlined. Love is a relation not of identity, but of will.
Mm.
So that one I really, really liked. And then this one, who is this from? I'm going to butcher this. I guess it's Josue de Castro. He said, every time a child is born, not just a mouth to feed is born, but hands and a brain. Mm-hmm. Yep. And he talks about in the same little section, he says, and I love this so much because we as a society and as a world, we are so overrun with the idea of scarcity thinking. And it just annoys the fool out of me. The idea that if somebody has more, that means I have to have less.
Yeah.
It's not just that people are taking your piece of the pie is getting bigger and everybody gets more. It says, but man is part of Earth and not merely on it. And the planet Earth, therefore, is not a finite globe at all, because when man is multiplied, intelligence is multiplied infinitely. Yeah. Like I said, the things I'm underlining, I'm understanding, and I'm loving. And then there's a lot of it that's just washing over me. So. But anyway.
Excellent. But it's a really good bath.
It's a really good bath. Yes. Yes. Really good bath. So I would say I'm enjoying it. Thank you, Abby, for setting me straight. Don't get bogged down. Don't try to understand every single thing and every single word. Just, enjoy the bath. So,
yes. Well, that segues into mine. So I'm Abby, and I have been reading, and this is my first time reading it, is Dante's Inferno. And I am reading the Anthony Esolen translation. Yeah. And a lot of it is having to wash over me too. But he does such a great job. I tried to read this last year, but I had a different translation. And then I had Anthony Esolen's lectures that he did for, I think it's Catholic something. Anyway, Catholic University, I want to say. But I have those on audio. But what I decided to do this time through, which is working out well for me, is I'm just going to read the Inferno first, and then I'm going to go back to the lectures. I was trying to do like read a canto, do the lecture, and back and forth. And it wasn't quite right. Like he was giving me too much of the piece of pie. So that is why I am just reading about a canto, like 2 or 3 a week, maybe a little bit more. It almost needs to be read aloud because it is poetry. And Anthony Esolen has even rhymed a lot of it, like his yeah, it's beautiful. So I keep thinking I'll just read a little bit, but then I'm just starting to read it out loud to myself because I don't think anyone in my family is quite interested in it. Or at least after school, they're like, no, Mom, we don't want you to read it anymore to us. But I've been reading it out loud and that has been great. But again, another thing that if you don't have a lot of mythology, you miss a ton. And he even gives really good little footnotes which are really helpful. And I'm glad I have as much mythology from surprisingly, my 6th grade teacher we did a huge delve into mythology and I loved it. And I'm also reading the Odyssey right now too. So I've got a lot of mythology this year because I'm doing the ancients and it's beautifully done. And the neat thing is Anthony Esolen puts on one page the Italian and then the other is the English. So if you want to, you can even kind of pretend like you read Italian and you can see how he's taking it. And I know there are people out there who read Italian. So if you do read Italian, you should definitely get this. I did not buy the book. I borrowed it from my library because I was like, well, I'm just going to see if this will fit into my medieval literature choices. And I ended up just loving it. So I think I'm going to actually have to buy it so that I can underline it. because I don't deface library books.
Yeah, that's good. Good policy.
And
we appreciate that.
Yeah, and he has some artwork in it as well. It's a really nice book. So I highly recommend it. And then I'm really looking forward to his lectures afterwards, because I think that will help, because he talks so much about it, but then he references things that happen later. And so it was just too much at one time. So I think I'm just going to keep going, read it through, and then listen to the lectures just for fun.
Cool. Yeah, the tricky thing about Inferno is that you don't have to know only mythology,
yes,
and history and scripture,
yes,
to understand what he's talking about. You also have to know his current Italian politics.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot that I am missing. I know this.
Well, it's just funny how even his, he's writing, including his current political situation, and that part's outdated.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's mixed in with so much that's timeless that then it
was hilarious how some of his, he just like conveniently put some of his political enemies in hell.
It needs the Karen Glass treatment is what it needs.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Harder to do with poetry.
That's true.
I don't know. Karen might be up to the challenge.
There you go.
Maybe when she's done butchering Charlotte Mason.
Brandy.
You mean offering a mentorship inside sistership that is wonderful, taking everyone through volume 1.
Without the Victorian.
Without the airing of rooms and woolen under things. Yes.
It's wonderful. It's like Charlotte Mason without Victorian era issues.
Yes.
I like it. I like it.
Just makes it all that much more timeless.
That's right.
That's true.
Okay, well, speaking of books washing over us, I guess that's the trend. Brandy, quick, pick a different book.
Like, you don't need to remind, it's not that hard.
I am listening to Road to Serfdom by Hayek. So it's my first econ book for my 5x5 challenge.
Oh, you chose to listen to an econ book. That sounds hard.
Well, it's the washing over, because I'm definitely not following every bit of the argument, but I'm also not getting bogged down.
True. Okay. Fair enough.
So it's been full of very interesting ideas, for sure. And I love how he starts each chapter off with a quote. I love that. And they're really interesting quotes too. There was a lot of front matter in the book that if I was reading the book, I would have skipped, but it's all included in the audio. So I just listened to the introduction by the new editor. And then there were 2 or 3 different introductions to various versions by Hayek, including the most recent introduction that he wrote for I think it was the second American edition. He wanted to clarify for the American audience that when he uses the word liberal, it's in the old British sense, which is almost the opposite of the American sense of the word liberal. And so it's just fascinating to hear him explain vocabulary and terms that might end up being ambiguous and causing confusion, pointing out, what liberal meant to the British audience of the 30s and 40s.
I love Hayek. Such an interesting guy.
Yeah.
My copy of Fatal Conceit is a lot like what you're describing for your Road to Serfdom. It has every introduction he ever made to any version ever. And I did make myself read it because I thought, well, this is how you find out kind of about the book and why they re-released it or why he changed what he changed. Because I think if I remember correctly, with Fatal Conceit, he actually changed a couple things. I think they were minor, but still, like there were some differences between my version and maybe an older version or something. But I remember feeling like, man, that was a slog just to get to the book.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Yeah. And he was really resistant to specify that socialism is the road to serfdom. He said people wanted to boil it down and say that that's what he was saying, but it's broader. Yeah. He's making the point that central planning is the road to serfdom. And socialism includes social planning, but so do other schools of thought and government. It's not only socialism, but it's central planning that's the problem. And so I pulled out this quote. He said, "We are ready to accept almost any explanation of the present crisis of our civilization except one. that the present state of the world may be the result of genuine error on our own part, and that the pursuit of some of our most cherished ideals has apparently produced results utterly different from those which we expected. So, yep, that was 80 years ago.
Well, we're still on the same road, so it's pertinent reading.
We are so much farther down that road that it's not even funny to be listening to it right now. But here I am.
Well, yeah, it's kind of the same thing with death of Christian culture too.
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I'm reading the easiest book out of all of us.
Slacker.
So I'm reading The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which has been on my shelf for years and years and years, just forever. It's one of those books where every year I'm like, I should read that. And then I thought, well, I'm going to assign it some year in high school, so I'll read it when my oldest is reading it. And then he ended up not reading it. Like we just changed some things in his school plans and that fell off of the list. In fact, I think he said he wants to read it when he comes home this summer. But anyway, the point is, then I ended up not reading it for when I was doing high school with him. And I just thought, you know what? I don't know that it's going to end up assigned. So I put it on my 5x5 challenge and started reading it. I'm probably about halfway through. So it is, like science history mixed with biography. So it's fairly easy reading, but the ethical questions that the book raises are definitely disconcerting at best.
Yeah.
So I've had this on my list. I keep looking at it and like almost and then not, and almost and then not. And I think it's the reason you just said, like, I'm fascinated by what went down, but I'm worried that it's just going to make me feel so uncomfortable.
It is, definitely you will feel uncomfortable. And it's one of those things where once the train is out of the station, you almost can't stop it. So it's like, at least this part, I'm halfway through. I have no clue what justice would look like in this situation. The whole thing feels very unjust and immoral. But I also keep reminding myself, I am reading the current state of bioethics into a different era.
Mm-hmm.
When this was also cutting edge, no one had thought through the ethics, which is typical of science. Do something and then think about the morality aspect later. But, they were literally creating the science. And so now, in this world where we're used to consent forms and informed consent, and the idea that you're not supposed to experiment on people without their permission, and also the idea that we protect privacy, we protect the genetic material. All of those things, they were innovated after the science was innovated. And so, this all happened in a pre-consent form sort of world. I mean, there was a general acknowledgement that you should ask, but they actually asked after they had already done a lot of it. Anyway, so for those of you who aren't familiar with the book, though, I'll just explain really quickly that this is the history of the Gila cell line. That is the first, what they call immortal cell line, which is the idea that they could keep sustaining these cells indefinitely. So they're still alive today, but they were harvested, the 40s or 50s? I'm trying to remember now exactly when it was. They're used for medical research, basically, but they were taken without consent. And then also they were taken without any they were taken from a very poor family without any compensation, even though people have made billions of dollars off of them. So there's also this idea that her whole family can't afford a doctor, and yet there's entire laboratories making millions of dollars off of her cells. It all feels really wrong. It's disturbing. It's disturbing to read, but I'm glad I'm reading it. So are we ready to transition?
On that happy note.
Yeah, on that happy note. Because I am just making everybody so cheerful today.
Hi, Abby here to give you an inside look into the community we call the Sistership. It is the place for homeschooling moms to gather and engage in meaningful, fruitful conversation. Schole Sisters is all about helping homeschool mamas in the trenches reclaim their own lives and their own learning alongside their children and alongside some friends. If you've ever found yourself listening to the podcast and wanting to join the conversation and discuss the ideas presented or ask a question, then join us inside Sistership, where we go in depth and extend the conversation so that we can engage with you. We are passionate about reclaiming and pursuing our own education, and we know that real education happens best in community. So join the conversation. Sign up at scolesisters.com.
We're going to go ahead and transition to a conversation that is based upon, if you guys want to buy the book and read it or read along or whatever, there are two translations of the title. So it's by Augustine or Augustine. We always say it both ways on the show. But I know what was it Pam said last time. Augustine is a saint and Augustine's in Florida, right?
Yeah, Saint Augustine's in Florida.
Okay. There you go.
Yeah.
But I always say it both ways because I have problems. The book is called On Christian Teaching or On Christian Doctrine. When you buy an English translation, it could have either title and it's the same work. We are zooming in on a few pages where he talks about what you need to know to read, basically. And with that, Mystie, I was going to let you do some introductory work if you would, since you gave us the reading assignment.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So this is really one of Augustine's main works on education. He's laying out a curriculum, if you will, or how to learn or what we should be learning. And a lot of it revolves around reading. What should we be reading? And he gives, the canon of scripture, which he actually, lays out book by book because that was still under discussion during his time. So he clarifies what is canon and lays out other books that should be read and that commentaries on scripture are okay to read and even a good idea. Then he goes on and is explaining really what it takes to read. And I think that this was really interesting because it seems like today we think of, learning how to read means learning phonics and how to decode. And once you can decode words, you can read. He spends a number of pages explaining what it takes to read with understanding. There's a lot of background knowledge that you have to bring to those words, which he calls the words signs. You have to know what those signs represent in order to pull meaning from the text. It's not only by not knowing what the words mean that you cannot understand. Like if, say, it's a different language and you don't know what those letter combinations, maybe you can even sound it out, but you still aren't getting meaning because the word is unknown. There's also not understanding those words because they're being used in a metaphorical sense. And if you aren't familiar with the thing that the word is representing, then you're not really getting all the meaning that's being represented by the author. Becoming a more educated reader includes learning about everything, basically.
Right. Yeah.
So when you're learning science and you're learning all these things, he's saying you have to learn all these different areas about the world if you want to be able to read scripture, because scripture likens things to different, physical world, creation, things metaphorically.
Right.
And so the more we know about the world, the more we're going to understand scripture itself.
Yeah. Imagine reading all we like sheep have gone astray and having no clue what a sheep is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think about the difference between even me reading that passage and Abby,
Yeah.
who actually owns sheep.
You don't know what a sheep is. Thank you very much.
And it's like, I have a general idea of what a sheep is. I've touched one before, but there's a whole different level. But I think about like when Charlotte Mason talked about reading a poem about a bee to students in the city who had never seen one, and how she had this moment of just like, we've got our work cut out for us,
Well, and I want to point out, like, I did intensive reading instruction education for like middle and high schoolers, remedial. This is how you teach kids how to read. Mm-hmm. And progressive educators are teaching this very same thing. Like it's totally new information. So it's like, this is vital to teaching kids how to read. And I'm like, wow, all they had to do was point me to Augustine and he was saying the same thing ages ago. So.
Well, yeah, because the first half of this book was written in the 300s, right? And then I was reading book 4 was added in the 400s, I think. I don't know. I was reading the introduction.
The first 3 books he wrote soon after his conversion. And then book 4 he added near the end of his life. So there was a big gap between those two.
And my guess would be, like a lot of things, I mean, he was a well-educated man. So my guess would be that he wasn't necessarily originating this, that this was not an unknown thing even then. So for at least 2,000 years, people have known that you need to know stuff in order to read. Mm-hmm. But I guess each generation, we all have to learn it for ourselves too.
Yeah, I guess so. So this kind of made me think about the grammar stage. Or the grammar stage, the grammar as in the liberal arts. Sorry, bite my tongue. But, old habits die hard. But that idea, isn't that what we're talking about is grammar is teaching you all the things you need to know so that you're able to read. So when he's talking about being able to read and understand things, he's not talking about necessarily the 8 or 9-year-old being able to read and understand things. The 8 or 9-year-old is working through that grammar process to come to know how to read things when they're an adult. Or am I missing this?
No, I think you're right. I think he's talking about handling scripture. So presumably he's talking to adults.
Right.
Because we wouldn't expect children to preach and teach inside the church.
Mm-hmm.
Unless they're Jesus.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you're right. And I was also thinking about this too, that when you get into really academic circles, even at, or sometimes especially at graduate level, there's this tendency to think that you can hide yourself away in the library and become a better read person and become completely disconnected from reality, cause and effect, nature, passing of seasons. All sorts of things. This kind of defeats that divorce that sometimes happens between the intellectual life and the rest of life,
mm-hmm.
and explains how it's all pertinent, even if your focus is still, I would say this is not just the intellectual life he's talking about, but for the sake of argument, that it really can't exist in isolation. You have to have the rest of reality in order to even know anything. Maybe it's that we can't know theoretically. I don't know.
Yeah.
So let's walk through these rules, because he has 3 very specific rules on what page is this? The page number was cut off at the top.
Sorry.
Of mine. No, that's okay. I just don't know what page I'm looking at. Oh, 37. It's page 37. In the particular copy you used, because you and I have different page numbers. That's why I ended up with a copy of it. But anyway, he says the first rule, oh my goodness, Pam, it reminded me so much of what you were talking about, taking the bath.
Okay.
So he says the first rule in this laborious task, and he's talking about reading, is, as I have said, to know these books, not necessarily to understand them, but to read them so as to commit them to memory, or at least make them not totally unfamiliar. Oh, he's making an argument for just that first read through,
mm-hmm.
where you don't get it all. And it's not supposed to be your last read through, but that there's a place for that kind of reading, that's the starting point.
You don't have to study through word by word on your first time through in order to learn.
Yeah. In fact, I wonder if that would be detrimental. I can't tell you how many times I got a little bit too into the minutia of a new book I was reading, and I would write a note, and sometimes like a kind of like a snarky question.
Mm-hmm.
And then I get to the next 2 paragraphs and the author deals with that. And it was like, if I was just patient and maybe listened instead of speaking, my marginalia wouldn't be so dumb. So,
well, I have been thinking about that in relation to listening to Road to Serfdom, or, listening to something like Brothers Karamazov or something, where go into it knowing this is not my only reading. This is getting the big picture, broad strokes feel of the thing. It definitely was that way with City of God, for sure. I'm just getting familiar with the kind of things that he's going to bring up in this book. This is not really reading City of God and understanding the arguments. This is getting a feel for it so that when I do read it, I'm going to have a bit of that big picture backing me up here. I know where he's going. I know some of the overall main points. And so I can have a more informed reading when I really do dig in, whenever that will be. Before I die, hopefully.
I think that's why I'm tempted to get into the weeds with the first reading, is because I know there's not time to reread everything.
Yep. And some of us aren't getting any younger.
Right. And so I'm like, I don't want to miss this opportunity.
I don't think any of us are getting any younger.
What's that movie where he ages backwards?
Benjamin Button.
Thank you.
Yep.
That was a weird movie. Anyway.
It's a short story by same person who wrote The Great Gatsby.
Isn't it?
Fitzgerald?
I think Fitzgerald wrote that. It's a short story. The Curious Tale of Benjamin Button.
Curious Case.
Everybody's Googling.
Oh, you were right. A short story.
See, I didn't need to Google. I think we think before you Google. I think that needs to be a new slogan. So, yes. Anyway.
I was telling Matt today that duck going doesn't work quite as well as a verb as Googling does.
That is true.
Yes.
I think we have to revive. I'm going to do an internet search.
Yes.
Okay, so step 2 then, after you've taken the bath, so to speak, he says, then the matters which are clearly stated in them, meaning the books, whether ethical precepts or articles of belief, should be examined carefully and intelligently. So there's that idea of the second reading,
right?
Having the more detail.
And that it takes having the big picture and seeing the whole thing before you can make a careful examination and draw some intelligent conclusions.
Right. Now, I'm going to mention step 3 really quickly, but I think the rest of our discussion today is really focused on that first and second level. I really don't think we're getting to level 3 in the discussion we're having, but I just wanted to mention it in case people want to know what it is, because there were only 3. The last one was after gaining a familiarity with the language, one should proceed to explore and analyze the obscure passages. And then there's that idea of like, take a more obvious passage to enlighten a passage that's hard to understand, which is the basic thing they teach in seminary even now, that you interpret scripture with scripture, but you use the easier passages to help enlighten you with the harder ones. I just thought I'd throw that in there so that we're not missing that step. But to go back to 1 and 2, then there was this idea of signs that you wanted to talk about, Mystie.
Mm-hmm.
You want to take us there?
So right after giving those 3 steps of basically how to read or levels of reading.
Yeah.
Then he says, in any of these levels, basically, the way that we fail to understand is by either the signs being unknown, so the words, or the signs are ambiguous. The meaning is not entirely literal. That's a lot of the way language is used. And so it's important to be able to recognize metaphorical use of language and then know the literal things that are being metaphorically referred to and be able to then draw some conclusions and observations and interpret that metaphorical use of language.
When somebody has a good example of an analogy or a metaphor, it really helps you understand things. Like you're like, oh yeah. And I just think of people who are good at making analogies or metaphors. It really does illuminate things in a different way. And I always appreciate someone who can do that.
Mm-hmm.
This really reinforces the necessity of what we're always trying to do with the 5x5 challenge, that wide reading. I think sometimes we can feel like the way to know more, especially like when it comes to education, the way to know more about educating is to keep reading more in this one narrow vein. That was my big temptation. I'm just going to read a whole lot of educational philosophy and I want to know it. So I'm going to read even more of it every year. I'm just going to keep piling it on. And there's nothing wrong with continuing to read it. I mean, I always have a category for that, but that didn't make me a truly educated person to just read in one subject area. And it didn't really set me up to have that type of comprehension that he's talking about here. That when you come to the table, having a broad swath of general knowledge, that just kind of opens the book up to you just by virtue of the wealth of knowledge that you've stored up inside of yourself. I guess it's like having a big bank account to draw upon versus the small one. When we're born, we don't know anything, so we have a zero balance. And hopefully we're adding to that. But if we read too narrowly, we're not adding to it in the way that we are when we're reading widely and broadly and getting all these different subject areas.
But I'm going to say one of the things, and this is an aside, but one of the things I love about the 5x5 challenge is because I do group those books together, and I'm doing 5 loosely grouped around this and 5 loosely grouped around this, then I'm able to make those connections. So
yes.
I think it's the perfect reading challenge.
I think so too. I'm not biased at all.
Well,
so
I say that as the person who had like literally nothing to do with its inception. So,
And refused the first year.
That's right. I
did. But she's come around, folks.
I'm trying to be better. Well, after Abby gave me permission to just let the books wash over me, made all the difference in the world.
So I don't even remember telling you this.
You did.
Doesn't matter. It was meaningful to your listener.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I believe I said it because it would be something I would say, but I just obviously this conversation had deeper meaning for you. Okay, I have one thing. So years ago, I read this really great blog post by my friend Mystie Winkler. And she was going through a series on, I think it's John Milton Gregory.
Oh yeah, the 7 laws of teaching.
On 7 laws of teaching.
I remember that
But one of the most powerful things that really has stuck with me, and I did look it up because I wanted to make sure I remembered it. He has the 4 levels of knowledge, which I think he probably just copied from this or similar. But number 1 is a faint recognition. And number 2 is the ability to describe in a general way. 3 is the power to readily explain, prove, and illustrate. And then 4 is a feeling of such deep appreciation for truth's deep, significant, and wide relations that we are compelled to act differently. In this, we're talking about, yes, you should have more than a faint recognition, right? Your first time through, maybe you know a little bit about it, but you're letting it wash over you. You're able to then describe it in a general way. And then having more of those things, reading more widely, you're able to explain, prove, and illustrate with analogies and metaphors and things like that. And then hopefully, with scripture, just appreciating its deep truths and significant and wide relations that, we are compelled to act differently. So I just thought that fit really well with what Augustine said.
It's interesting with the signs and what's unfamiliar, what we don't understand. I was most interested in talking about this metaphorical use of language. So we kind of we're skipping the several pages that is on understanding languages and translations that he talks about. You have to become familiar with the words themselves in order to understand the words. But then he talks about words used metaphorically and how we come to understand those better. And so he says on page 43, as for metaphorical signs, any unfamiliar ones which puzzle the reader must be investigated partly through a knowledge of languages and partly through a knowledge of things. So then he has a little bit, saying things like Hebrew names have meaning. And so translators render no small service to posterity when they explain that the names have meanings. But then its ignorance of things makes figurative expressions unclear when we're ignorant of the qualities of animals or stones or plants or other things mentioned in scripture for the sake of some analogy. And he has some examples that I assume we're going to talk about. But through this section, he's saying, you have to know about animals and nature, stones, herbs. He says anything that has roots.
That narrows it down.
And then later on page 46, it's even music. It says many passages are made inaccessible and opaque by an ignorance of music. The section that we read for this episode ends on 47. And he says, a person who is a good and true Christian should realize that truth belongs to his Lord wherever it is found. And so he's not afraid to gather it and acknowledge it even in pagan literature. Some of that knowledge in his time, they were gathering this knowledge from pagan authors. And that's part of what he's answering in this book. What's valid for a Christian to study? So a little bit he's saying, studying biology and nature and music is helping your understanding of scripture. And therefore it's worthy to study.
This reminds me of some of the resources that Charlotte Mason used in her classroom for Bible. I remember looking at her commentaries one time and thinking I feel like the word commentary is kind of a misnomer. compared to what I would think about a commentary. Because I would think of a commentary being verse 1 and then notes on verse 1 that help you understand verse 1. What she was using, or at least the ones I've looked at, were a lot more this kind of stuff. It was, if you're going to read the story of Jesus and his disciples walking through the field and, on a Sabbath, and they're like taking some of the tips of the grain off to eat that and all that. The commentary she's talking about is going to tell you about grain. It's going to tell you about maybe the climate in that area, why they would be walking. What background in the law do you not have to understand why that would be controversial? It was enlightening, but it wasn't enlightening in some sort of exegetical, detailed breakdown of every verse in the passage. It was more like, here's all the background knowledge that's going to really open this passage up to you.
Yeah, we have a book like that, and it's called a Bible Atlas.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's what for a long time, I was like, how can we find something like this? And I didn't realize, for whatever reason, because she's called it a commentary, I had trouble leaping to, oh yeah, that atlas I bought in seminary would probably be actually the best substitute for what she's talking about. I just my brain didn't make the connection for a long time, but totally. So now I leave my atlas out sometimes and I can just kind of flip through it and look at pottery and all sorts of things.
There's a book that was recommended to me and I have not read it yet, but it's A Shepherd Looks at the 23rd Psalm.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's so good. It's so good.
Okay. So you've read it, but that same kind of idea of breaking down the 23rd Psalm and talking about all the things you don't think about, all the things you don't know from the shepherd's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. So my favorite podcast right now is actually the number one podcast in the country, which is not Scully Sisters. I'm sorry.
We're number 2.
I'm sure we are. But the number one podcast in all of the country and has been since the beginning of the year. And that's the Bible in a Year podcast.
Really?
Oh, wow.
Father Mike Schmitz.
That's awesome.
Number one in all categories.
I did not know that.
That's awesome.
Yes, and has been. So has been for almost 3 weeks now.
Wow.
One of the things I absolutely love about it, he reads the scripture. They're using, Jeff Cavins has this Bible timeline, which goes through the 14 narrative books of the Bible. And then he goes in and puts in the other books kind of where they go. So the books of poetry. And right now we're doing Genesis, Job, and Proverbs together. And so he'll read the pieces of scripture and then he'll come back and he'll give us all the juicy tidbits, all the things that you don't know that just makes all the difference in the world.
So
to
cool.
The reading of scripture. And so we learned that, when Noah's son looked upon his nakedness, that it actually has a different meaning than just seeing him without his clothes on. And so it's just been excellent in that way and has totally opened up so much more about the scripture in a way that's accessible to a lot of people.
So you're like the 4th person to recommend it.
Oh, wow.
Recently. My neighbor is listening to it.
Is recommending it.
Everybody is number 1.
Oh, and people online have 4 is probably light. I think that it's probably closer to 10 at this point. So many people are like, oh yeah, I've been doing that too. So I believe it that it's number 1, but how wonderful is that?
It's just a completely accessible way to experience the Bible.
Guys, I feel like I live in a hole. How did I not know? My word. Okay. Very cool.
It's been recommended in sistership a few times.
How did I miss? Not like I don't sign in. I don't know how I missed it. Okay. Well, now I know. Pam told me.
Yes, that's right.
There you go. Beyond an atlas, how are we going to get these things and how are our kids going to get these things? We could listen to Pam's podcast. Recommendation there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go to church.
Right. But I do think these principles lend themselves to more reading than just scripture.
Yes.
How are you going to understand philosophy, Plato? How are you going to understand anything? While the Bible does have some peculiar obstacles to it, many difficult books that we would like to read have the same obstacles because the biggest obstacle is our own ignorance of the background knowledge required to read the book.
One of the things that the whole snake thing made me think of when Mystie was talking about that was what Andrew Pudewa talks about in his fairy tales talk about how, the dragon's bad. You don't really have to be told. And I think, is that a Chesterton quote or something like that, or attributed to him or something? So you get these feelings and these things because of these stories. So for our kids, even our youngest kids, like fairy tales, poems, all of these stories, the book list, the good books list that's in the back of the Death of Christian Culture, just this wide, broad reading of most things you can get your hands on.
Yeah.
Or did I totally miss the boat there?
No, I agree with you.
As well as nature study.
I was thinking that. Yeah, that's what I was going to add too. Observation.
Yeah. There's not an area of knowledge that's excluded. All of it plays together. You have to go get knowledge from all these different areas.
To astronomy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we were doing an artist study the other day, and it was on Michelangelo, and one of my kids recognized something, and he's like, oh, that reminds me of, and now I'm forgetting what he said. I should have written it down, but he had made another science of relations kind of connection to a different artist that we had studied before. It was just something offhanded, a comment, and they just do it. But like, I think that that's part of this, right? When you have that wide and broad feast of ideas, as Charlotte Mason would say, right? Then you are able to make more connections and see things more fully.
So does poetic knowledge fit in here somewhere?
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the poetic knowledge comes first before you're really able to interpret or analyze the meaning that's going on.
I wonder if actually poetic knowledge is part of taking the bath too. I think it also precedes the bath. Like I wouldn't limit it to that. We talk about poetic knowledge being sort of like a pre-critical, pre-analytical, pre-cognitive, we use these kinds of words like it comes before, not that we don't do those other things, but it comes before. When I look back at page 37, the difference between the first two steps, where the first step is you're not really even reading to understand it, but you're reading to become familiar with it, versus step 2 is when there's an analysis sort of level that's happening. You're examining carefully and intelligently. It seems to me poetic knowledge precedes it and then follows us into that first reading.
Okay, so then is committing them to memory, or at least make them not totally unfamiliar, would that be like memorizing things?
I was wondering if it was narration, because Augustine is one of the ancient examples of truly using narration. In more than one of his books, he has someone give a full and complete beginning to end narration. On the Teacher is a really good example where he actually gives this grammar lesson to his son, and then his son completely narrates back before they move on, connecting it to this reading. He does that. It's committed to memory in this really basic point before they move on to the more critical stage of analysis and application.
Okay.
If you look at what Augustine does On the Teacher, narration fits into that stage 1. It has to come before any sort of analysis.
And I think that part of the poetic understanding is the wonder, the being interested and intrigued by things. And that comes up on page 45 in number, which I think is something, we just don't get anymore. And I don't, I am intrigued by the way he interprets number in this.
My brain
in City of
turned
God,
off.
In City of God, it's even more than this. So.
Well, so we got to tell people what we're talking about because they didn't read the book with us. So, but tell them, because I seriously was like, my brain went, never mind. Yeah. And I was like, surely it's not as bad as it feels, but I have no concept of this at all.
Yes. An unfamiliarity with numbers makes unintelligible many things that are said figuratively and mystically in Scripture. An intelligent intellect, if I may put it thus, cannot fail to be intrigued by the meaning of the fact that Moses and Elijah and the Lord himself fasted for 40 days. The knotty problem, Knotty, the knotty problem of the figurative significance of this event cannot be solved except by understanding and considering the number, which is 4 times 10, and signifies the knowledge of all things woven into the temporal order. The courses of the day and the year are based on the number 4. The days divided into the hours of morning, afternoon, evening, and night. The year into months of spring, summer, autumn, winter. When we live in the temporal order, we must fast and abstain from the enjoyment of what is temporal for the sake of the eternity in which we desire to live. So then the number 10 signifies knowledge of the Creator and creation. And he goes on to explain why we know that, and then what it means with 10 times 4. And so he's using this 40 number basically to defend that we need knowledge of all things temporal and spiritual. And we see this in their fasting.
And I walked away from that like, I'm just going to take your word for it because I know you're a way smarter guy than I am.
Well, he told you that up there.
Yeah, that's true. He did tell me that.
He told you he was way smarter.
The intelligent intellect, anyway, can get this.
Right. And I was like, man, I'm obviously out of this category.
I wonder if one of the reasons why we struggle with this is because we don't live in nature like they used to.
Could be.
He starts talking about the day is divided into 4. I'm like, is it? Really?
Yeah.
You know? And then he said it and it made perfect sense. But because we live so much under artificial light and our own time and things like that, that we've kind of gotten out of some of the things that maybe we would be more in tune with.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, because when I've read scripture, I have noticed the pattern of 40 days. Like even with Noah, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. But never did I jump to anything remotely like this in my brain. But it could be. It's true that like we don't have to differentiate between morning and night if we don't want to, because of our conveniences of electric lighting and heating and all those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. It seemed like Common Core stuff to me. He just jumped immediately to it's 4 times 10. I'm like, no, it's just 40. Come on. Don't start breaking it down.
Well, it's the same even with the snake example.
Yeah, read that part. That was great.
So he says, this marvelously illustrates the meaning of the Lord's injunction to be as wise as serpents. And when I was reading this, I stopped there and I said, okay, so the metaphorical meaning of wise as serpents. I think, well, I guess I've always just read that as, well, so I guess that means that serpents are wise.
But
and we should be wise.
He started that where you read, he started that with the well-known fact about the snake.
You're right. That's true.
That it offers its whole body to assailants in place of its head, and I'm like, I didn't know that.
I didn't know that. I know. So I'm just the first time I read that, I was realizing that I was reading it and I knew it was a metaphor, but I guess I just took only the literal meaning. Actually, I just assumed, okay, it says wise as serpents. So serpents are wise and we should be wise. And I'm really only looking at wise or wisdom. And always thought, well, that's kind of weird. And he says here, so let's look at how snakes behave. And
everybody knows.
No, yeah, right. And what it means then. So he says it means in place of our head, which is Christ, we should offer our body to persecutors, so that the Christian faith is not, as it were, killed within us when we spare our body and deny God. And the fact that the snake confined in its narrow lair puts off its old garment and is said to take on new strength chimes in excellently with the idea of imitating the serpent's astuteness in putting off the old man in order to put on the new, and doing so in a confined place. For the Lord said, enter by the narrow gate. I was like, huh.
I remember in seminary reading some of this and then basically being taught, but you're not allowed to do it that way.
Well, I was like,
but then I was reading him and I remember at the time being like, that seems weird. But now that I realize how much more qualified he is than me, I'm like, maybe that's just a safety measure.
Well, it's the same thing. I do think, something like the Lord is my shepherd or we're all sheep sort of thing. I think Abby could enlighten us as to some underlying meanings there that I would totally miss. That even in reading about or having heard about sheep and shepherds or having read a few novels that feature, I read Heidi, right? So that, goats, sheep, they're kind of the same, right? And I could make some connections there. But I really shouldn't be allowed to do that.
Goats are really smart and can get out of anything, and sheep are really dumb.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an insult that he tells us we're like sheep, basically. If he had said we were like goats, we'd be like, we're clever.
Yeah, but then what happens to the goats?
I know. I'm the sheep. They're not that clever because they end up dead.
See?
That's
you
true.
don't want to be clever.
But, is that the lesson? Wow. You said in here, Mystie, knowing things helps you read better. That was kind of one of your conclusions here. And I was thinking it would be fun if you guys could give some examples when you're reading a book as a family or just for one of your kids on their own or whatever, but like the background knowledge that you were studying somewhere else. Well, here's an example. Let me give an example because this happened to us over the summer. So I like homeopathy. So like last year during the school year, I read the very, very basic homeopathy book aloud to my kids. They got into it. They were hilarious. They like started trying to fix cuts and bumps and bruises in the neighborhood and all this stuff. But the point is that Louisa May Alcott was into homeopathy, and that was the main kind of medicine at the time that she was writing. And so she will make comments about homeopathy, homeopathic remedies, that kind of stuff that just kind of, I mean, I remember reading as a kid and it just like totally flew over my head because I didn't know anything about it. So my kids had read the book before, but when we read it aloud, this is Little Women, as we read it aloud this summer and they had that background knowledge, they were like, wait, what? Say that again. I mean, they were just all so excited because they were seeing that background knowledge made that part of the book come alive. And I guess that can happen with that book also because it's structured around Pilgrim's Progress. But if you haven't read Pilgrim's Progress, you can still read the book and enjoy it, but you won't understand why the chapter titles are what they are and why the progression of the book is what it is, because it's actually kind of fan fiction. It's built upon this other thing. Anyway, so I'm thinking like those kinds of things. Have there been these times where you feel like, oh, this book just came alive because of something else over here that helped me read it better or help my child read it better?
I'm going to say yes, but I can't remember.
I've got one example.
Okay.
So we were reading in a nature book, and I think it was one of, what's the author's name? He draws really neat, and they're black and white sketches. And this one was on weather.
Eric Sloan. Sorry.
What? Eric Sloan. Yes, Eric Sloan. That's it. He makes really great observations about the world. One of the things that he talked about, he brought in poetry, and he talked about how Jesus was talking about the red sky. And we all know the poem, red in the morning, sailor's warning, red at night, sailor's delight, right? And he brought that in, and he said that even Jesus quotes something similar to it in one of the Gospels and talking about, the calm before the storm or whatever. So I know that we recognize that from the poem and from, our own observations. So that was one thing. And then he talked about the woolly bear caterpillar. And we have woolly bear caterpillars here in Oregon. Oh. The woolly bear caterpillar, he has the two black ends and then the orange belly. And they said that one of the defining characteristics of the season, if it's going to be a hard winter, the band is going to be larger. And if it's going to be a more mild winter, it's going to be a smaller band.
Oh, that's right. I remember that.
And that was just interesting because then we would see the woolly bears and we would say, okay, which is it going to be? And so just knowing those things from a book deepened our understanding and appreciation for the woolly bear caterpillar.
Totally makes sense. And then if you read a poem that talked about the woolly bear caterpillar stripe being super wide, and then it was about a bad winter, you would get it, right?
Yes.
Versus the rest of us would be like, what? How are those things connected?
that Eric Sloan book is wonderful. And it has all sorts of things like that. And he brings in quotes and different things from different places.
It goes both ways, right? Knowing things helps you read better, but reading also helps you understand what you're seeing in the real world too.
Yeah.
I mean, those are both true. The general principle holds true that one book is connected to another, whether they're in the same category or not, just because, God is a unity and all knowledge is ultimately tied up in him. And so we're going to see the overlap, and it would make sense because of the nature of God that reading one thing is going to enlighten the next thing we read and so on and so forth. And that it just continues to build. All right. How do we land the plane? Speaking of analogies, we could use this quote. The number of years given in the gospel for the building of the temple, 46, has some musical overtones.
Is someone turning 46 this year?
No, I just was thinking about how knowing things would help me read that better. So I was like, huh. I mean, I play piano and sing. Well, not well at the same time. But I'm like, I have no idea why that has musical overtones.
Well, I don't know either. It was 46, right? I was trying to break it down. I was trying to break it down to see if I could find like an 8 in there somewhere.
You're like, obviously 4 times 10.
Plus 6.
Plus 6.
There are 8 notes in the scale. I don't know. Did they have 8 notes in the scale then, or did they have a different?
I'm thinking that medieval music might have been, or not, I guess
they're
early
like, we
church.
have 12 notes in our scale.
Yeah.
I don't know. You know what? That's a good point though, Pam, that the way they thought about music might be very different from the way that we think about music, because their notation was even different. They didn't have the scale and staff and all that stuff yet. So then maybe
it was very chanty.
Yeah. But maybe that is why when I read that, I'm like, who knows why that would be the case? But it could be because if someone had said the number 8 has musical overtones, I would be like, oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So
I don't know where the Egyptian gold is.
I don't think she gave us that.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't.
And I read from the beginning. So, I mean, there's some really good stuff in book 1. Yeah.
Here we go. Here's a good quote. So this is outside the assigned reading. It's on page 54.
Okay.
He said, the whole area of human institutions which contribute to the necessity of life should in no way be avoided by the Christian. Indeed, within reason, they should be studied and committed to memory.
That's great.
So there's really nothing in the world, in God's creation, that is off limits for study by Christians. Things that are created by God in the world. He does have a spot on superstitious things being man created, but whatever God has created, which includes history and the societies of men, should be studied by the Christian for the sake of knowing God better and expanding the kingdom.
I love that that's his ultimate purpose. We're not just knowing things to be better humans, or, I mean, all that stuff's very nice, but he wants us to know more and therefore read better so that we can better know God and better serve God. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is very oriented to the Lord in a way that I think we sometimes forget to do that. Like, we know we ought to, but, most people don't teach phonics thinking that someone's going to know God better.
Mm-hmm.
And on that note, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
You're so welcome.
That's it for today. And that's not just it for today. That's it for season 14. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our special summer episode. All of the books and things mentioned in today's episode are linked to our show notes. Just go to skolesisters.com/SS90, that's SS90, to check it out. Don't forget to become a Sophie level member of the sistership. You will get our spring training sessions with Rosaria Butterfield included this month, along with access to all the other wonderful things going on, and our annual summer gear. Sign up at skolesisters.com/sistership. I wish you a fond farewell for the time being. We are going to take our usual break, and we'll be back midsummer with our special summer episode. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone. So open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters. Oh, is it what's his name? The weather book guy?
He has weather book. Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. And cut a lot, Brandy. Mostly what I said. So there we go.
No, I don't think so.
I'm starving.
Oh, good.
Mission accomplished.